The burner phone buzzes against mahogany, my son's life on the line. My own board planted the kidnapping, a test of my ruthlessness before the merger. I've got Marcus's phone, a direct line to Leo's captors. But the messages reveal the truth. This was never about money. It's about control. And I'm holding the only weapon they didn't expect, my son's worthless reputation. The crystal award in my hand still drips blood from Marcus's skull. Security's coming, but the real fight starts now. One wrong move, and Leo's gone. One right move, and I own them all. The smell of stale cedar and expensive scotch clung to the walls of the study, a scent that usually signaled a successful closing or a quiet evening of reflection. Not today. Arthur Sterling pressed the phone to his ear, his thumb tracing the jagged, cold edge of a heavy brass paperweight. On the other end, a voice distorted by a digital grit, like gravel being ground in a silk bag, delivered the ransom demand for his son, Leo. Arthur's chest tightened, a momentary hitch in his internal machinery, but his face remained a mask of cold, lined marble. He didn't blink. He watched the second hand of the grandfather clock in the corner, waiting for the precise moment the speaker would pause for breath. Michael Davis stood across the mahogany desk, his round face pale, clutching a leather briefcase as if it were a life preserver. His eyes darted toward the ticking clock, then back to Arthur. The silence in the room was heavy, thick with the smell of old paper and the ozone of the high-end security systems humming behind the wainscoting. Arthur set the receiver into its cradle with a sharp, final click that echoed like a gunshot. "Michael, liquidate the trust," Arthur said. His voice was flat, devoid of the tremor that was currently vibrating in his marrow. "Every cent. I want it accessible within the hour." Michael's mouth hung open for a heartbeat. He adjusted his glasses, the blue light of his tablet reflecting in the lenses like twin cold stars. "Leo's entire inheritance?" "Sir, the market volatility, the penalties for a withdrawal of this magnitude." Arthur slammed his palm onto the desk. The vibration rattled the crystal decanters on the side table, the amber liquid inside sloshing against the glass. "Now, Michael, convert the holdings into a liquid reserve. We are not discussing market trends. I need a weapon, not a legacy." The assistant nodded, his collar suddenly looking 3 sizes too small for his neck. He began tapping at his screen, the frantic clicking of his fingernails against glass the only sound in the room. Arthur turned his chair toward the floor-to-ceiling window. Below, Manhattan flickered like a bed of dying embers. He wasn't thinking about Leo's safety. He was calculating the kidnapper's ROI. He had 47 identical white shirts in his closet, each numbered to ensure he never wore the same one twice in a month. He lived by a grid. Chaos was the enemy, and this kidnapping was a massive, unscheduled dent in his reality. "The board will demand an explanation, Arthur," Michael whispered, his voice shaking. "A withdrawal of this size triggers every red flag in the system. They'll think you're being coerced." "Let them howl at the moon," Arthur muttered, watching his own reflection in the glass, a ghost haunting a tower of steel. "They don't understand that everything has a price. Even my son. Especially my son." He gripped the velvet armrests until his knuckles turned as white as his numbered shirt. He wasn't just paying a ransom. He was buying back an asset that had been stolen from his inventory. He would treat this like any other hostile takeover. He would find the weakness, exploit the margin, and crush the opposition. The transition from the quiet study to the high-tech war room was a descent into a world of humming cooling fans and the sterile scent of sanitizing wipes. Arthur strode through the glass doors, Michael trailing behind like a shadow. The room was bathed in a pale, flickering light from the wall-sized monitors showing fluctuating stock tickers and security feeds. Arthur didn't sit. He stood in the center of the room, the soles of his polished shoes clicking rhythmically on the raised metal flooring. "I want the dossier, Michael," Arthur commanded. He didn't look back. Every academic failure, every rehab invoice, every gambling debt Leo has accrued in the last 24 months. I want to know exactly what he's worth on the open market when he's at his absolute worst. Michael fumbled with a secondary device, his fingers trembling. "Sir, is that wise? If the kidnappers see we're looking at his liabilities, they might think we don't value him." "That is precisely the point," Arthur snapped. He turned, his eyes locking onto Michael's with the intensity of a predator. "If I approach this as a grieving father, they will bleed me dry. But if I approach this as a man looking at a depreciating asset, a broken machine, then the price goes down. I need to devalue the hostage. I need them to realize that Leo is more of a burden to me than he is a prize for them." The air in the war room felt thin, over-filtered. Arthur watched as the screens populated with Leo's history. A failed semester at Yale, a crashed Porsche in the Hamptons, a series of wire transfers to offshore betting sites. Each document was a brick in the wall Arthur was building between himself and his son. He remembered Leo as a child, counting the stairs in the foyer because he was afraid of falling. 1, 2, 3. The boy had always lived in fear. Arthur had tried to cure him of it with discipline and spreadsheets. But all he'd done was create a man who fled into the dark. "I'm seeing a pattern of transfers to a group in Queens," Michael noted, his voice gaining a sliver of professional distance as he looked at the data. "High-stakes underground poker. He owes them 6 figures, Arthur. Maybe more." "Excellent," Arthur said, though there was no joy in it. "Factor that into the negotiation script. We'll offer to settle his debts as part of the ransom. We'll make it look like we're doing the kidnappers a favor by taking him off their hands. We are not rescuing a son, Michael. We are restructuring a bad debt." Arthur reached out and adjusted the angle of a water glass on the central table. It was a fraction of an inch off-center. He moved it until it was perfectly aligned with the edge of the coaster. Only then did he feel the phantom itch in his brain subside. He was in control. The numbers were lining up. The peace of the war room was shattered not by a phone call, but by the physical intrusion of the past. The heavy security doors at the end of the executive suite didn't just open. They were forced. The sound of grinding metal and the shouting of a panicked receptionist drifted down the hall. Arthur didn't move. He stood behind his desk, his hands resting flat on the mahogany, feeling the vibration of heavy footsteps approaching. Marcus Miller burst into the room. He was a man built of muscle and resentment, his work shirt stained with grease and his cuticles raw and bleeding from obsessive picking. In his right hand, he swung a heavy, rusted pipe wrench. The smell of the machine shop, burnt oil and old sweat, filled the sterile office, a violent contrast to the scent of cedar and expensive cologne. "You don't even remember me, do you?" Marcus screamed, his voice cracking. He stopped 10 feet from the desk, his chest heaving. 15 years, Sterling. 15 years I gave this company, and you fired me 2 weeks before my pension vested. You didn't even look at me when you signed the paper. Arthur's eyes didn't flicker to the wrench. He looked at Marcus's eyes. You were a line item in a restructuring phase, Mr. Miller. Your performance metrics had dipped below the threshold of profitability. It wasn't personal, it was math. Marcus roared, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage, and lunged. He swung the wrench in a wide, desperate arc aimed at Arthur's head. Arthur didn't scream. He didn't even breathe. He waited for the apex of the swing, then stepped inside the man's reach, a move as calculated as a chess opening. He felt the rush of air as the wrench whistled past his ear. Using the momentum of the man's own weight, Arthur grabbed Marcus's wrist and drove his elbow into the man's solar plexus. Marcus gasped, the air leaving his lungs in a wet wheeze. As the intruder stumbled, Arthur grabbed a heavy crystal award from the desk, a jagged, translucent mountain of glass, and brought it down across Marcus's jaw. The sound of the impact was sickening, a dull thud followed by the crunch of bone. Marcus collapsed, his head hitting the floor with a hollow sound. Arthur didn't stop. He pinned the man down, his knee digging into Marcus's spine, a physical manifestation of his corporate dominance. He could feel the man's heart racing through his back, a frantic, animal rhythm. "Security is on the way, Marcus," Arthur whispered into the man's ear. "You've added a criminal record to your list of liabilities." As Marcus groaned, his fingers twitched near his pocket. A smartphone slid out onto the carpet. Arthur reached down and snatched it. It was a cheap burner, the screen cracked and smudged with grease. He stood up, smoothing his tie and checking his watch. The struggle had taken exactly 42 seconds. "Michael," Arthur called out, his voice steady as if he'd just finished a light lunch. "Have the cleaning crew come in. There's a blood stain on the rug. And get me the bypass tool for this phone. I want to see who Mr. Miller has been talking to." Subverted beat 1.4. Arthur stood over the unconscious form of Marcus Miller, the heavy crystal award still gripped in his hand. He felt a surge of cold, academic triumph. He had handled the physical threat with the same efficiency he handled a hostile board meeting. This was his world. He was the master of variables. He looked down at the cracked screen of the confiscated phone. This was the key. He would find the kidnappers, trace the signal, and end this disruption to his fiscal year. He felt a rare sense of optimism, a belief that the system, his system, was working perfectly. He navigated to the messaging app with the confidence of a man who had already won. He expected to see messages from a low-level gang, or perhaps the bookies Leo owed money to. It made sense. It was logical. These were the types of people Marcus Miller would associate with. Arthur's thumb hovered over the screen, ready to harvest the data that would lead him to his son. He felt a sense of relief, his shoulders dropping an inch. The crisis was being managed. He was the watchmaker, and the gears were turning in his favor. The first message he opened was a string of coordinates. The second was a confirmation of Leo's arrival at the warehouse. But it was the sender's name that made Arthur's thumb freeze. It wasn't a nickname or a scrambled number. It was a secure, internal handle he recognized instantly. He scrolled up, his heart beginning to thud against his ribs like a trapped bird. The correspondence went back weeks. It wasn't a kidnapping for money. It was a performance review. "Subject is secure," one message read. "Sterling's response time is within the predicted window. Proceed to phase 2, the emotional stability test." Arthur's breath hitched. He saw a message from Robert Chen, the oldest member of his own board of directors. "If he breaks, we move for removal immediately. If he pays without hesitation, we cite fiduciary negligence. Either way, the merger proceeds without him." The world didn't just tilt, it disintegrated. The very men he had spent decades building this empire with, the men he had shared scotch and secrets with, had turned his son's life into a stress test for his leadership. They weren't looking for a ransom. They were looking for a reason to kill his career. The kidnapping wasn't a crime of passion or greed. It was a boardroom maneuver. Arthur looked at the blood on the carpet, then at the phone. He wasn't the hunter. He was the asset being liquidated. He realized with a sickening jolt that every move he'd made, liquidating the trust, devaluing Leo, had been exactly what they wanted him to do. He had walked straight into the trap, thinking he was the one setting it. His knees felt weak, the cold marble of the office suddenly feeling like thin ice over a dark, bottomless sea. He had lost more than his son. He had lost the illusion that he was the one in control. The video arrived 10 minutes later, a digital slap to the face. Arthur watched it on the primary monitor in the war room, the flickering light casting long, dancing shadows against the walls. On the screen, Leo was tied to a wooden chair in a room that smelled of damp concrete and rot. His eyes were wide, his pupils blown with terror. He was muttering something. Arthur leaned in, hearing the faint, rhythmic counting. 1, 2, 3, 4. The boy was counting the seconds, or perhaps the cracks in the floor. Above his head, a digital timer glowed a malevolent red, counting down from 60 minutes. Sarah Johnson stepped into the frame. She didn't wear a mask. She wanted him to see the scar through her eyebrow, the physical mark of the wreckage he'd left in his wake. She hummed a low, vibrating funeral dirge, a sound that seemed to rattle the very speakers of the monitor. Arthur pressed the intercom button. His voice was a rasp, a dry wind over sand. "I have seen your theatrical display, Ms. Johnson. Let us skip the melodrama. I am prepared to offer $200,000 for the return of the unit." On the screen, Sarah stopped humming. She leaned into the camera, her eyes cold. 200,000? For your only son, Arthur? That's less than you spent on the rug in your lobby. It is a fair market valuation for a depreciating asset, Arthur said, his fingers gripping the edge of the desk so hard the wood groaned. Leo has no standing in the company. He has no specialized skills. He is a liability with significant debt. 200,000 covers his outstanding obligations and provides a modest profit for your time. Anything more would be a poor investment. He watched Leo's face on the screen. The boy stopped counting. He looked directly into the camera, his expression shifting from terror to a hollow, devastating realization. He had heard his father's voice. He had heard himself being appraised like a piece of surplus machinery. "You're a monster, Arthur," Sarah whispered, a dark smile touching her lips. "But I already knew that. The clock is ticking. Let's see if your math can stop a bullet." The screen went black. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the hum of the servers and the distant, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the study. Arthur felt a bead of sweat roll down his temple. He had to keep the mask on. If he showed a single crack, the board would pounce. He was being watched, not just by the kidnappers, but by the men in the shadows of his own company. The air in the war room suddenly turned frigid. The temperature control system shrieked, a high-pitched mechanical wail that set Arthur's teeth on edge. The lights overhead flickered, long, rhythmic pulses that forced him to blink, creating a strobe effect that made the room feel like it was breaking apart. "The system is being breached," Michael shouted, his fingers flying over his tablet. "Someone is bypassing the internal firewalls. It's like 1,000 fists pounding on the door at once. Arthur, I can't hold them back." "Redirect the data flood to the backup system," Arthur ordered. But even as he spoke, the monitors began to die, one by one, their blue light fading into a dull, dead gray. A sharp click echoed from the corner of the room. Arthur turned to see his private wall safe, a masterpiece of biometric security, swinging open. The heavy steel door groaned on its hinges. He rushed to it, his breath coming in short, jagged gasps. He reached inside, his hand brushing against the cold velvet lining. Nothing was missing. The ledger, the emergency diamonds, the hard drive containing the board's offshore accounts. It was all there. They didn't take anything, Arthur whispered, the smell of ozone and burnt dust filling his nostrils. They don't need to take anything, Michael said, his voice trembling as he stared at the open safe. They're showing you that they can get in. They're showing you that your walls don't exist. It's psychological warfare, Arthur. They're proving you've lost control of your own house. Arthur felt a shiver of genuine fear. The safe was his last line of defense, a physical manifestation of his privacy and power. To have it opened so effortlessly, without a single alarm, was a violation more intimate than a physical blow. He realized then that the board wasn't just testing him. They were dismantling him, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but a hollow man in an empty tower. The first shot didn't sound like a gun. It sounded like a stone hitting a frozen lake, a sharp, crystalline crack that shattered the silence of the executive suite. Then, the floor-to-ceiling glass wall exploded. Thousands of shards of reinforced glass rained down like a diamond storm, glinting in the strobe light flicker of the dying overheads. Arthur felt a stinging heat across his cheek as a fragment sliced the skin. He didn't think. He reacted with an animal instinct he hadn't used in decades. He dived for the floor, his chest slamming into the plush carpet. Another shot whined overhead, thudding into the mahogany desk with a sound like a hammer hitting a ripe melon. The smell of cordite and pulverized drywall filled the air. Arthur crawled on his stomach, the glass shards biting into his palms and knees. He reached for his leather briefcase, a heavy, reinforced piece of luggage he'd bought for its durability. He pulled it over his head, a pathetic, expensive shield against the lead rain. "Michael, get down," he roared. But the assistant was already huddled under a side table, his hands over his ears. From the neighboring rooftop, a flash of muzzle fire sparked against the night sky. The assassin was methodical, pinning them down with rhythmic fire. Arthur could hear the thwip-thwip of the bullets passing through the air, a sound like a whip cracking inches from his ear. He tasted copper, blood from his sliced cheek, and felt the cold, hard reality of his own mortality. He wasn't a CEO here. He wasn't a billionaire. He was a target. He dragged himself toward the hallway, the briefcase scraping against the floor. Every inch was a struggle, his breath coming in ragged, sobbing hitches. He reached the heavy oak door of the war room and rolled inside, slamming it shut. The wood groaned as a bullet buried itself in the outer frame. He lay on the floor, staring up at the ceiling tiles. He counted them instinctively. 1, 2, 3, 4. He was becoming his son. The terror was a physical weight, a cold hand squeezing his heart. He realized with a jolt of pure, icy clarity that the board didn't want him to fail the test. They wanted him dead. In the flickering, dim light of the server room, Arthur huddled over Marcus Miller's cracked phone. The air was hot here, smelling of scorched electronics and the hum of 1,000 spinning drives. His hands were shaking, a fine tremor he couldn't suppress. But his mind was beginning to knit back together. He needed data. He needed a way to fight back. He accessed the phone's deep logs, bypassing the simple messaging apps. He looked for the biometric trail, the record of who had touched the device and when. He pulled up the security logs for the executive elevator from the night of the kidnapping. The screen showed a thumbprint scan. Arthur's breath caught in his throat. He ran a comparison against the company's internal database. The match wasn't Sarah Johnson. It wasn't Marcus Miller. It was Leo. Arthur stared at the glowing blue lines of the fingerprint. His son's biometric signature had been used to unlock the secure elevator at 2 a.m., allowing the kidnappers to bypass the lobby security. The boy didn't just get caught. Arthur whispered to the empty, humming room. He opened the door. He felt a wave of cold, bitter fury. Leo hadn't been a victim. He had been a collaborator. He had staged the kidnapping to pay off his gambling debts, working with Sarah and Marcus to squeeze his father for the trust fund. The terror in the video, the counting, the tears. It had all been a performance, a play designed to break Arthur's bank and his spirit. Arthur leaned his head against the cool metal of a server rack. The irony was a jagged blade in his gut. He had spent his life trying to teach Leo the value of $1, and the boy had finally learned. The fastest way to get it was to steal it from his father. But as Arthur scrolled further into the encrypted messages on the burner phone, the fury began to curdle into a different kind of dread. He saw a final thread of messages between Sarah and an unknown contact, a contact he now realized was Michael Davis. "The boy is becoming a liability," Sarah had written an hour ago. "He's losing his nerve, wants to call it off." The reply from Michael was chilling in its brevity. "The contract has changed. The board requires a permanent solution. The father dies in the office, the son dies in the warehouse. We liquidate the entire Sterling line tonight." Arthur's blood turned to slush. The fake kidnapping had turned into a real execution. Sarah and Marcus weren't just disgruntled employees. They were the board's cleanup crew. They had used Leo's greed to get inside, and now they were going to use his body to bury the Sterling legacy. Leo wasn't in on a plot anymore. He was a loose end. Arthur looked at the red countdown clock on the phone's screen. 30 minutes left. The son who had betrayed him was now a boy, waiting to be murdered by the very people he thought were his allies. Arthur felt a sudden, violent shift in his internal landscape. The math didn't matter anymore. The ROI was zero. The only thing that remained was the raw, animal need to protect the only thing in the world that shared his blood. He stood up, his legs feeling like lead. He didn't call the police. They were likely on Michael's payroll. He didn't call security. He grabbed a heavy mag light from the emergency kit and headed for the service stairs. He was going to the industrial district. He was going to save his son, or he was going to die trying. The notification on his tablet chimed with a polite, corporate ding as he reached the parking garage. Arthur paused, the sound echoing in the concrete cavern. He tapped the screen. It was a formal notice from the board of directors. Due to recent events and a demonstrated failure of leadership during a period of extreme personal duress, the board has voted unanimously to initiate a hostile takeover. Your position as CEO is hereby terminated, effective immediately. Your access to all corporate accounts and assets has been revoked. Arthur stared at the words. They had cited his cold response to the kidnapping, the very negotiation tactics they had goaded him into, as proof of mental instability. They had used his own strengths against him, framing his professional detachment as a psychological break. He tried to log into his primary account. Access denied. He tried his personal bank. Credentials revoked. He was a billionaire who couldn't buy a cup of coffee. He was the king of a mountain that had just turned into a landslide. He looked at his Patek Philippe watch. It was still perfectly synchronized with the wall clock in the lobby. But for the first time in his life, the time didn't belong to him. He was a ghost in his own empire. He climbed into his car, the only asset they hadn't managed to lock yet, and roared out into the night, the smell of burning rubber a dark omen of the fire to come. The industrial district was a wasteland of rusting skeletons and the smell of sulfur and burnt rubber. Arthur steered his car through the potholed streets, the headlights cutting through a fog that tasted like poison. He reached the warehouse, a massive, decaying structure that loomed over the street like a tomb. He stepped out of the car, carrying a heavy duffel bag. It was the trust fund cash, or at least what he had managed to pull before the lockout. He felt the weight of it in his hand, a physical manifestation of his power. He was going to buy his son back. He was going to fix this. The air was heavy, the silence broken only by the distant, rhythmic thud of a metal door swinging in the wind. Arthur walked toward the entrance, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He felt like a man walking into a trap, but he didn't care. The math was gone. There was only the boy. He entered the warehouse. The smell of rot and damp concrete was overwhelming. In the center of the room, under a single, flickering bulb, Leo sat tied to the chair. His face was bruised, his eyes vacant. The countdown clock on the wall read 5 minutes. "I have the money," Arthur shouted, his voice echoing in the vast, empty space. "Let him go." Sarah Johnson stepped out of the shadows, the lead pipe in her hand glinting in the pale light. She wasn't smiling anymore. She looked tired, her eyes reflecting a decade of accumulated hate. "It was never about the money, Arthur," she whispered. "It was about the confession." Sarah didn't look at the bag. She looked at Arthur's face. "Do you even remember his name? My brother? Thomas?" Arthur froze. The name flickered in his memory. A small engineering firm in Ohio. A hostile takeover. A restructuring. "He was a business rival," Arthur said, his voice cracking. "He lost the merger. That's the way the world works." "He lost everything!" Sarah screamed, lunging forward. She swung the lead pipe with a sickening wet thwack against Arthur's ribs. The air left his lungs in a ragged gasp. Arthur fell to his knees, the pain a white-hot explosion in his side. He tasted blood. He looked up at Sarah, his vision blurring. "He killed himself in the garage of the house you repossessed," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a low, haunting hum. "I found him. I had to clean his blood off the concrete so the bank could sell the property. And you didn't even remember his name." She hit him again, a blow to the shoulder that sent him sprawling into the dirt. Arthur felt the cold, gritty reality of the floor against his cheek. He looked at Leo, who was watching with wide, terrified eyes. "I'm sorry," Arthur whispered. But the words felt hollow, like dry leaves in the wind. He had spent his life building a tower of glass, and he was finally seeing the bodies he'd used for the foundation. Subverted beat. 3.5. Arthur gasped for breath, his hand clutching the duffel bag. He saw Sarah raising the pipe for a final, crushing blow. He had to play his last card. He had to use the only language he knew. "Wait!" he choked out, shoving the bag toward her. "The money. It's all here. $2 million in cash. Take it and go. You can start over. You can have the life your brother lost. Just let Leo go." He felt a surge of desperate hope. This was the logical conclusion. Sarah was a criminal, and criminals were motivated by profit. He had provided the profit. He had solved the equation. He watched her eyes, looking for the flicker of greed that would signal his victory. He felt a moment of profound relief as she lowered the pipe. His shoulders dropped, and he allowed himself a single, ragged breath. He had won. He had bought their lives. Sarah reached down and unzipped the bag. She reached inside, her fingers brushing against the thick stacks of $100 bills. She pulled one out, holding it up to the flickering light of the single bulb. Arthur watched her, a small, pained smile touching his lips. "It's all there. I liquidated everything. It's yours." Sarah's expression didn't change. She rubbed the bill between her thumb and forefinger. Then she held it closer to the light. "The ink," she whispered. "It's bleeding." Arthur's heart stopped. He lunged forward, grabbing a stack of bills. He felt the paper. It was too smooth, too light. It felt like office paper. He looked at the top bill. The portrait of Franklin was slightly blurred, the green ink smearing against his thumb. It wasn't money. It was high-quality counterfeit. "Michael," Arthur breathed, the truth hitting him like a physical blow to the stomach. Michael Davis hadn't just locked him out of the accounts. He had swapped the real cash in the study with a bag of fakes before Arthur left the building. He had sent Arthur into the lion's den with a bag of paper, ensuring that the kidnappers would have every reason to kill him. Arthur looked up at Sarah. The hope was gone, replaced by a cold, murderous rage in her eyes. He realized with a sickening jolt that he had no leverage left. He had tried to buy his way out with a lie he didn't even know he was telling. He was worse than a victim. He was a fool. He felt the world tilt, the floor of the warehouse suddenly feeling like the edge of a cliff. He had lost everything, his company, his money, and now, the last chance to save his son. Sarah didn't scream. She didn't even speak. She grabbed Arthur by the collar and dragged him toward the back of the warehouse, his heels scraping against the concrete. She threw him down a flight of wooden stairs into a damp, dark basement. Arthur hit the floor hard, the air leaving his lungs again. He heard the heavy steel door at the top of the stairs slam shut. The sound of 6 deadbolts sliding into place echoed like a series of gunshots. He lay in the dark, the smell of mildew and old oil filling his nostrils. He heard a sound from the corner, a rhythmic, whispered counting. 1, 2, 3, 4. "Leo," Arthur whispered. 5, 6, 7. Arthur crawled toward the sound, his hands brushing against cold, wet concrete. He found his son huddled in the corner, his knees pulled to his chest. The boy was shaking so hard his teeth were chattering. "Leo, it's me. It's Dad." Leo didn't look up. 32, 33, 34. Arthur reached out and touched the boy's shoulder. Leo flinched, a violent animal reaction. "They're going to kill us, aren't they?" Leo whispered, his voice small and hollow. "The clock is going to hit 0, and the room is going to go away." Arthur looked up. Above them, through a gap in the floorboards, he could see the red glow of the countdown clock. 2 minutes. He was trapped in a basement with a son who hated him. No money, no power, and a lethal clock ticking away their final seconds. He had spent his life trying to avoid this exact moment, a situation he couldn't control. And now, it was all he had left. Arthur stared at the ceiling, his mind racing through the wreckage of his life. He saw a small, glinting lens in the corner of the basement, a hidden camera. He realized then, they were being watched. Sarah was broadcasting this. She wanted the shareholders to see the great Arthur Sterling broken and begging. She wanted to destroy the brand before she destroyed the man. Arthur felt a spark of his old self, the predator, the negotiator. He stood up, leaning against the cold wall for support. He looked directly into the camera lens. "I know you're listening, Robert," Arthur shouted, his voice echoing in the small space. "And you, Michael. You think you've won. You think you've liquidated me." He took a deep breath, his ribs screaming in protest. "But you forgot one thing. The Sterling server has a secondary encryption layer, a logic bomb I planted 10 years ago. It's tied to my biometric signature. If my heart rate hits 0, the entire system wipes itself. Every offshore account, every merger document, every cent of the company's assets, it all turns to digital ash. It was a lie, a desperate, high-stakes bluff. But he said it with the cold, absolute confidence that had made him a billionaire. You want the company, Robert? Then you need me alive. Because if the clock hits 0, you're not just killing a man, you're killing the bank. He watched the camera. He waited for the flicker of a reaction. In the room above, the counting of the clock slowed. The red numbers paused at 0:15. The steel door at the top of the stairs groaned. Sarah stood there, the phone in her hand. She looked confused, her eyes darting between Arthur and the screen. "They're telling me to stop," she whispered. "They're telling me you're more valuable alive." Arthur didn't wait. He lunged. He used the only weapon he had left, his body. He slammed into Sarah, the weight of his desperation driving her back against the doorframe. He grabbed her wrist, twisting it until the bone popped and the phone clattered to the floor. As she screamed, Arthur reached into the secret pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a small, silver penknife, a gift from a Swiss banker. It was a toy, a trinket. But in the dark of the warehouse, it was a scalpel. He drove it into Sarah's shoulder, the metal sinking into the muscle. She collapsed, the dirge hum turning into a wet, gurgling sob. Arthur grabbed Leo, hauling the boy to his feet. "Run!" he roared. They burst out of the warehouse into the cold night air. The fog was thick, smelling of rain and exhaust. Arthur could hear sirens in the distance, the high-pitched wail of the police. "We're safe," Leo gasped, his legs buckling. "Dad, we're safe." But as they reached the street, a fleet of black SUVs pulled up, blocking their path. Michael Davis stepped out of the lead vehicle, flanked by a dozen armed men in tactical gear. Behind them, the police cars arrived, their blue and red lights painting the street in a frantic, strobe-like rhythm. Michael didn't look like a scared assistant anymore. He looked like a king. He pointed at Arthur, his face a mask of righteous indignation. "There he is," Michael shouted to the police. "The man who staged his own son's kidnapping to cover his embezzlement. Arrest him!" Arthur looked at the police, then at Michael. He realized the final move. Michael wasn't just taking the company, he was taking the narrative. He was the hero who had found the kidnapping plot. Arthur was the villain. The trap had closed, and the jaws were made of the law. The legal battle that followed was a war of attrition, fought in the silent, wood-paneled rooms of the High Court. Arthur used every scrap of digital leverage he had, the recordings from Marcus's phone, the biometric logs, the logic bomb bluff, to claw his way back from the brink. He won. He reclaimed his empire. He saw Michael Davis led away in handcuffs, his face pale and sweating. He saw Robert Chen forced into a voluntary retirement. He sat in his executive chair once again, the smell of cedar and scotch returning to his walls. But as he sat there, he looked at the primary monitor. A video was playing, the viral footage from the warehouse basement. He saw himself, cold and calculating, looking into the camera. He heard his own voice, clear and sharp as a diamond. "Leo is a zero-value asset, a liability. I am not rescuing a son. I am restructuring a bad debt." The words hung in the air, more permanent than any contract. He had saved his money. He had saved his life. But he had shown the world, and his son, exactly what was in his heart. He looked at his watch. It was perfectly synchronized with the wall clock. 12 p.m. The day was in perfect sequence, but the room felt empty, a gilded cage at the top of a mountain of glass. Leo didn't come to the office. He didn't call. He sent a single handwritten note on a piece of plain white paper. "I'm done counting the stairs, Arthur. I'm walking away from the mountain." The boy had officially renounced his inheritance. He had disappeared into the city, a ghost among millions, taking nothing but the clothes on his back and the memory of his father's appraisal. Arthur sat in his reparations glass tower, the panoramic view of Manhattan laid out before him like a map of a kingdom he no longer cared to rule. He reached out and adjusted the angle of a water glass on his desk. It was a fraction of an inch off center. He moved it. He moved it back. He realized then that he could align every glass, synchronize every clock, and number every shirt in his closet. But he could never fix the broken math of his own soul. He had won the war, but he was the only one left on the battlefield. He sat in the silence, the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock echoing in the hollow space of his chest. 1, 2, 3, 4. He was finally counting the things he had lost. And for the first time in his life, the numbers didn't add up to a solution. The end.